Welcome to the first episode of Stratagems. My name is Ruben Ugarte, and in this podcast, I want to deconstruct the strategies that organizations have used to dominate their industries. Not just the superficial levels of what the strategy is, but really dive deep into the world that shaped the strategies, the trends, the conditions, the factors that made organizations and specific individuals make certain strategic choices. In this first episode, we're going to look at what I think is one of the most fascinating stories out there, the story of Sears. Now, Sears is, of course, a household name. Today, in 2024, the company doesn't really exist in any significant fashion. I think there's around maybe 13 stores today, still open somewhere in the United States. But Sears did not start with retail stores. It did not start with the big box stores, actually. It started with the mail order catalog. The Sears catalog would become one of the most influential pieces of literature, of books, that shape American preferences and, in a way, American history in the early part of America. We're looking at a period today from 1886 to 1925. And over this 35 years, Sears would go on to become this huge behemoth, this huge organization with orders and revenues in the hundreds of millions at that time, which would be billions of dollars today. And it did it all with just a catalog, a book. And that's the story, that's the strategy we're going to deconstruct. This might not be the Sears you know. If you ever walk into a Sears store like I have, this is not that Sears. It's not the Sears yet. This is the Sears that preceded the big box retailer. Now, Sears was founded in the age of schemes. And the primary person we'll look at in this story, Richard Sears, was, of course, someone who grew up and died in this age of schemes. And mail order was perhaps the greatest scheme of all. Now, strategies aren't effective forever. And their period of 30 years or so, give or take a few years, shows that. It shows a strategy that made sense because a specific man made sense. But by the end of the period, by the 1925, we'll see how the world around Sears is now changing. And all the factors that will eventually make mail order obsolete were present for 10, 15 years before we get to the end of our time period. And that's, I think, what's most exciting about strategy. It's response to what we see right now, trying to ride a wave of trends and changes of demographics. But when that wave changes, we have to catch another wave. So with all that being said, let's start our story by looking at Richard Sears himself, the key figure in our story. And we're going to pick up that story in 1886. Let's start this story by looking at the early years of Sears. And we have to start by looking at the man who is most associated with Sears at this point in time. Now, there'll be multiple people who each have their own influence on the company, and you'll see them throughout the story. But we have to start with Richard Sears. The story of Sears starts in 1886, but Richard Sears was born on December 7th, 1863. Now, there's really not much about his early life, his teenage years. But when he's 17 or 18, he goes and he manages a railroad and express office in Minnesota. This is where we're going to pick off. So here's Richard, a teenager in our day, but a young adult in his. He was already responsible for providing for his family, for providing for himself, and he goes to manage a railroad office. Now, we're going to talk about railroads a little later on, but just imagine these are the offices where the different trains would stop. And he was an officer at this office, and he would do many things, such as taking in the packages, ensuring the trains are on time, and so on. Now, while he's working as a railroad office, and he doesn't really earn much as an officer, he starts trading with the farmers and the Indians, the Native Americans, around his railroad office. Now, or at least the majority of the railroad officers did this, right? It's just a way for them to get extra income. But it kind of starts to show some of the elements that we're going to see in the Sears company later on. You see, Richard started to just do some basic trade-in. He would sell lumber and coal and other products to the townsfolk. And from those customers, he would in turn purchase meat and berries, and then he would ship those to other localities, right? He would know other railroad officers across America, and he would ship them. He would start to become a sort of a middleman, selling things, buying things. Now, you got to remember this, because this will be important very later on. So he gets a chance to interact with the farmers, with the Native Americans, with the other railroad officers. He's buying things, he's selling goods, he's getting a sense for what's popular, what's not. So all of this is going to be very, very important when we get to the story of Sears. Now, in 1886, and where we want to start the story, Richard receives a package of watches. He's about 23. He's still at this, station railroad agent. And he gets a shipment of gold watches from a Chicago manufacturer. But the local person who was supposed to receive the gold watches, his name was Edward Stegerson, he refused this shipment. Now, this shipment was actually sent unsolicited to Edward. It was a very common tactic. One we'll see Richard himself use, where you would send a package to a person, and it might be a real person like Edward, and as a manufacturer, you had a few possibilities here. Maybe the person like Edward accepts the package, great. If the person who you sent this unsolicited package rejects it, then maybe the railroad agent, in this case Richard Sears, will take it. And in the worst case, it would just get returned back to the manufacturer at their own cost. This sort of unsolicited package, hoping it lands on someone's desk, so to speak, was a common strategy of the day. Manufacturers would ship it, and sometimes they would even ship it to fake names altogether, right? What they were really hoping is that the station agents, like Richards, would take them, because they knew other station agents, they knew the farmers, they knew Native Americans, they knew all kinds of customers. So very, very common tactic. We can see it's a little shady, might be the right word, but nonetheless, just a way for manufacturers to get the products out there into the hands of people who can sell them. So the person, Edward Stegerson, not a fake name, he rejects the package. Richard accepts them. So the manufacturer gets what they were hoping for. Now a station agent, like Richard, has them. Now Richard decides, he's buying these watches at $12, and then he decides that he's going to send them along to other station agents that he knew and that knew him, and he gives them a very simple offer. Sell the watches for anything above 14, right? So Richard was gonna allow the station agents to buy the watches at $14. Effectively, Richard Sears was going to make a profit of $2, and the station agents could then sell them above 14. Now, these watches themselves were retailing at around $25. So for other station agents, they had this sort of $9 spread where they could make their own profit. Richard makes his profit of $2. And of course, the manufacturer gets to sell the watches. You can see it as a sort of win-win all around if we put aside the whole, unsolicited package thing. Now, here's a fun fact here about watches. And watches will become the first major product on which Sears starts as a company. Not just Richard Sears himself, as we'll see here, but even the company as a whole would really focus on watches for the first few years. Now, watches at this point in time, we're in 1886, are becoming ever more popular because time zones have been recently adopted by railroad companies. Now, today we're all familiar with time zones, Pacific, Eastern time, European time, London time, and so on. But time zones actually came into adoption in the 1800s. And railroad companies before time zones all had their own times, which, as you can imagine, is chaos if you're trying to get a train to arrive at a specific time. So after many, many years, by many people, this is beyond the scope of our podcast, time zones are now being adopted by railroad companies. And thus, the people around them, the people who interact with the railroads, the farmers who may depend on railroads, now actually have a requirement for watches. So watches are a particularly popular item at the time. Now, these gold watches were also quite nice, right? They had an appeal with the farmers that the different station agents were going to sell to. And Richard knew this, right? He knew this customer. He knew the area. Something that's also unique about how Richard starts is he didn't actually need capital. I mentioned that he bought the watches for $12. It wasn't actually technically true. He promised the manufacturer that he was going to pay $12 for each watch. He got the other station agents to pay him $14, and then the station agents could then sell it for whatever they wanted. But Richard didn't have to put upfront cash. Remember, the manufacturer sent this unsolicited package without being paid for it. The deadline itself for paying back to manufacturer, what Richard had to do, seems somewhat flexible. So he got a great opportunity here. He got a chance to take stock of watches, to give them to other station agents. They would sell them. They would then give him the money, or mail him the money would be more accurate. He will collect all the money, take his profit, and then pay the manufacturer. This, again, another element that we're going to see later on, this idea of how Richard was able to start effectively sort of mini business with zero upfront capital. Now, Richard was very successful at doing this, right? So he started with this, unintentional, unsolicited box of gold watches. He continued to do it, effectively the same idea. He would get something from the manufacturer. He would then give it to the station agents or perhaps sell it himself. He would then collect all the money, take his profit, and then pay back the manufacturer. Very little upfront capital. There's records here that even he started to use the sort of the fake address, unsolicited package tactic, right? So maybe he would give gold watches, and he would send them to other station agents that perhaps he didn't know with the fake address, hoping that they would pick it up and so on. It's a very intriguing, sort of very simple business proposition that just made sense at the time. Now, after about 6 months of doing this watch trade-in, specifically watches, he earned around $5,000 at the time, which is around $165,000 today, just to give you a scale of sort of how much money he was making doing this arbitrage of watches. And there's several lessons that Richard picked up from here that we're going to see in the company itself in just a few minutes, right? One, he had great success doing this, right? He had the ability to move the watches, or at least he had the ability to recognize a product that was attractive to a specific customer, farmers in this case. He had some skill in sales, at least in getting people to sell the things that he had. He had very minimal capital needed. And some of these elements will eventually morph into something else, right? When he starts to advertise himself for products and so on. So very, very simple sort of business proposition that Richard started almost by accident when he's 23, right? You got to remember, he's in his early 20s. He spent 6 months. He makes the equivalent of $170,000 US dollars today. So he's doing pretty well, right? He's obviously earning much more than just a regular station railroad agent. Now, after 6 months of doing this watch trade-in, he decides to move to Minneapolis, and he creates the R.W. Sears Watch Company. So now he wants to take the whole thing to the next level, right? He wants to have an actual company, perhaps work with manufacturers more closely, and maintaining some of the same elements, right? He knows the customer is going to be somewhere near those railroad stations. Clearly, the railroads are going to play a key role, but he wants to sort of build on this. Now, in 1887, right, it's about a year after he started this whole watch trade-in, he moved to Chicago, and Chicago was a great choice because it was a railroad hub at the time. Now, if you imagine the United States, the majority of the railroads were really in the eastern part of the United States, right? You can imagine sort of the original 13 colonies. So there's a good population that has been built in the eastern part of the United States. And as railroads have expanded, different cities have become hubs, Chicago being one of those. So he moves to Chicago simply because of the convenience to all the different railroads. It has a freshwater port. It's a growing city. And he thinks this could be a great place to start a business or to start his really, watch company. And the railroads are a key element here, right? I have a whole section of this later on, but just remember that, right? So he knows 1888, he's in Chicago. he decides to publish his first catalog. Now, this catalog that he publishes really only features watches. There's some jewelry, but that's really it, right? So now he's taken his great initial experience selling watches on a one-on-one basis with other agents, but now he decides to put a catalog together. Now, we'll talk about catalogs in a second as well. Richard Sears did not invent the catalog concept. It precedes him by many years. There were already other mail catalog companies like Montgomery Ward that were quite established, but he decides that this is going to be one of his ways of reaching customers, the farmers, right? At the same time, he's going to start to advertise in farm publications, mailing flyers, all the different ways of reaching the customer that he got to know when he was a station agent, the farmers. Now, there's something intriguing about the watch industry at the time. There was a trade association that had a very high level of regulation of the watch industry, and it forced manufacturers to keep prices high. In fact, if members violated any of the laws, they would get expelled from this trade association, which would be a huge issue for them. They would be prevented from trading and so on. The plus side for Richard and what he realized of this is when manufacturers discontinue watch lines, maybe a specific product, he could then actually work with the manufacturer and get those discontinued watches at reduced prices, and he would then just do a great job advertising them. Again, another thing that we're going to see Richard play out over and over again. So this highly regulated industry became a great source of business for Richard. He could get cheaper watches, watches that might, sell for $10 or have a cost of about $10. He might be able to sell them for $15, $18, but they retail for $25. He's finding this great arbitrage opportunities here, just in this one area of watches. In this story, this early years, we're really only looking at 1886, 1887, 1888, and the initial start of Richard Sears as a 23-year-old, 25-year-old, he's 25 in 1888, has so many of the elements of which Sears will eventually be built into this great company. He is already doing a great amount of money at a very young age. He clearly has a knack for selling watches at the very least. He has a knack for this noticing opportunities, for this arbitrage that he discovers. This is almost one of those, he's very good at what he does from the very start. So how is Richard going to grow this? How is he going to become the Sears that we'll eventually get to know? That will require a few more steps. But before we get to look at the earlier years of Sears, when other people come on board, we have to look at why the specific customer that Richard Sears identified, the American farmer, why this market was so valuable and yet underserved by other manufacturers and other companies. Let's dive deeper into the American farmer in the 1800s. The key customer that Richard Sears went after, and that really Sears, the company, went after with all its heart, all its energy, was the American farmer. Now, the American farmer at this point in time is a little bit different from the American farmer today in 2024. You see, in 1861, this is about 20 years before we began our story back in 1886, only about 14% of Americans lived west of the Mississippi. Now, by 1890, the number was now closer to 27%. And of course, the expansion west started in the 1800s and kept going. The majority of the Americans, of course, were still in the eastern portion of America. The 19th century was really the era of the farmer in the United States. Thomas Jefferson once claimed that the farmers were, quote, the chosen people of God, if he had ever chosen people. And farmers really became the heart of America at this point in time. Agricultural wealth was 56% of the GDP of the nation in 1850. This will, of course, go down to about 22% by 1912. So while the American farmer was the heart of America, it's also in a decline of sorts. But at this point in time, agriculture is a good chunk of the American economy. A lot of this was driven by the Homestead Act in 1862. this is a law that made it easier for people to claim land. And you got to check this out. It really provided a legal basis for people to take over pieces of land. You could file an application. You could then take about 160 acres of land, and you can file a deed to take ownership, and you would pay about $1.25 per acre, which is about $38 today. So you can just imagine the United States at this time was really not that populated. Now we're really not diving deeper into the conflicts that were taking place between the many people who were going expanding west and looking to take over pieces of land, and of course the Native Americans. That's not really the scope of this podcast. But you just got to remember that there's a lot of people, especially after the American Civil War, who all they really want is to go find their own piece of land and become farmers and grow their own products and then make a living, right? Have a family, have kids, and so on. Now, as late as 1880, the United States was 71.8% rural. And as I mentioned before, agriculture was, of course, the single biggest source of wealth, or GDP, as we would consider today. Now, politicians never forgot this. They always catered to the farmers. There were many laws and many things that went through in Congress at the time, such as the Homestead Act. They were designed to appease farmers as being the primary voters and the primary needs. But the businesses had a hard time reaching them. There were changes in the U.S. at this time, and businesses were not doing that great of a job to reach them, to really provide their needs. Now, the farmers here had very specific attributes that made them, on one hand, a great customer base, a great customer segment. On the other hand, we could see why they were underserved. Now, these farmers had very high birth rates. They were highly educated, and they really lived in towns with, on average, less than 2,500 people. You're talking about very small towns. The population of the country increased from about 31 million and a half in 1860, right, just around the American Civil War, to about 92 million by 1910. You're talking about a birth rate, I think, of about like 4.3, just to give you comparisons to what it might be today. And they were really spread out. Even though they were in the small towns of about 2,500 people, the farmers themselves might actually live 20, 30 minutes, an hour away by horse, of course, at this time, from the town center. So very spread out, but at the same time, very educated, right? You had immigrants who were coming from England and Europe and so on, and they had a high level of education, which meant they had a high need or desire for reading materials. They wanted things to read, right? You imagine yourself on the farm, an hour away on horse from the town center of a town that only has a couple thousand people, maybe at most. So the need for entertainment was very high. It was actually said that in New England villages and sort of New England farmers and so on, their only recreation was funeral occasions, just to give you a sense of who the farmer was. Now, the farmers were also experiencing a lot of opportunities. Not only were they a powerful political group just by their sheer numbers, but they were also having new opportunities economically. So they had all kinds of new opportunities to sell their goods. They had to sell the things they grew and planted, especially because of railroads, which we're going to cover in the next section. So the railroads were providing all kinds of opportunities for a farmer in New England to be able to sell their goods elsewhere in the country, to be able to ship those goods in a timely manner, with some restrictions. They were having increased income from all these new opportunities, from the increase in prices that they were seeing, but they were limited to what they could buy. Their main source of goods, the main business that provided for farmers at this point in time, was the general merchandise store. Think about this as a general store in each town. This was actually really the main competition to Sears as a company that we're going to see play out over and over again over the next date period that we're looking at. Now, this general merchandise store was typically run by a merchant, this someone who lived in town. This person, of course, had multiple roles. In a small town, he primarily he, but it might be a she as well. He or she might have to be the postmaster. They might have a church above in the attic. And they were really a nexus for the community, right? This general store that sells everything for the small town was where people came to hang out, right? It was sort of the village social center, mostly for men. But it was here the politics, religion, neighbors were discussed. And it's likely that the major questions of the day, right? The tariff question, a government bank, internal improvements to the town, to the country, foreign policies, and really any other important national matters were really settled inside the general store. Now, the farmers themselves had many issues with the rural merchants. Besides their role as sort of the nexus of the community, they were not fully happy with these merchants. The supply, the availability of products for these merchants was low. It was a limited supply, and the demand was uncertain. Perhaps the biggest issue the farmers had with these rural merchants were the prices. The prices that they had to pay for things were quite high. Now, there were many factors for this. The merchants bought on credit. So you imagine here's this rural merchant in a small town. He or she has to buy all those products. They had to buy them on credit. Now, the farmers themselves also paid on credit. Farmers, even if they were wealthy, if you want to use that word, even if they had money, it was quite a very cyclical kind of business they were in. So they were very poor at the start of the season, the cropping season. And by the end of the season, they had money to be able to pay back. So they expected merchants to be able to accommodate this. So for them to be able to buy all these things on credit throughout the year, and then they would settle their accounts at the end of the cropping season when the farmer himself got paid. Now, of course, what this means is, 100 credit customers who religiously settle their accounts at the end of each crop season were then often forced to pay for the accounts of another 100 who did not. So the merchant had to take on this risk. Now, here's an example for how much the price difference was. In the South, which is really not too dissimilar from the West and other parts of the U.S. at this time, it is said that a barrel of flour in 1894 sold wholesale for $3.47. But before it reached a customer's hands, the farmer in this case, the price was at least $7. It's about a 100% increase. Another example, a pair of shoes, a brand called Brogan Shoes, they could be bought wholesale for 75 cents a pair. But they retail at prices close to $1.25 to $2.25. Woolen clothes or suits, for example, were bought for $3.25 to about $15. It's sort of the range for it. But they sold from $10 to $25. And finally, meat was 5 to 7 cents a pound, but then sold for many multiples of that, right? So farmers knew this, right? Farmers were, on one hand, one part of the economic equation, selling their products to this wide and ever-increasing market of the United States, and even an increasing market internationally, as railroads made it possible to ship products across the country and of course, to other countries. But they did not have many options to buy products from their rural merchants. Now, you want to remember this, because this is really the gap that Sears is going to exploit. Richard Sears knows this, right? He knows the farmers. Remember, he was a station agent where he interacted with farmers himself. He knows the area. He knows the rural merchants himself, of course. He knows all this. And now he's back in Chicago with his watch company and with a catalog just full of watches. So we'll see how all these elements will come together to build this mail order business that Sears will transform into this incredible company. Now, before we do that, let's take a step to look at the second development, the second sort of factor that allows Sears to flourish. We have mentioned it multiple times, but let's dive a little bit deeper into the railroads in the 1800s. In just the first 20 minutes or so of this podcast, we have mentioned the railroads multiple times. So it is time we give it our full attention. Now, the railroads are a critical background element to Sears. There's a fantastic book that's in the show notes about the railroads, and it has this great quote that it really made me think about the impact of railroads. And the author of the book, The American Railway, argues that the world of today differs from that of Napoleon Bonaparte more than his world differ from that of Julius Caesar, and this change has chiefly been made by railways. Now, railroads, and so on are not completely new to this time. We see elements of railroads all the way back in ancient Greece and the Roman Empire, where they were using limestone to be able to move carriages from one spot to another. Typically, the tracks were made of sort of two lines of cut stones. Eventually, iron rails would take their place, and then the use of metal became more extended. These railroads were, more commonly called tram roads in some countries, and of course, they were used to carry coal from the mines to the places of shipment, and perhaps the boats themselves. There were very few and didn't really attract a lot of attention. What's interesting about the railroads is in the 1800s, we have development and a change in these railroads, right? And this change, what we can see in the 1800s, and of course, even eventually, if you go into the 20th century, is that the grand function of these railways in mass scale, as we're seeing the start of our story here, really changes the whole base of civilization, right? It becomes easier to maintain armies, for example. Now you can ship things to armies, different sort of camps around the country. You can ship products across the country. There's an argument that perhaps some of the rebellions, like the rebellions of the southern states and the Civil War, would not have been possible to put down without railroads. And eventually, railroads, aided by telegraphs, then allows an entire country to be connected, to be communicated. So this is a major, major development. But the development is not the railroad. We can see that existed all the way back to ancient Greece. The idea of having a track on which you move some kind of vehicle. And if you look at the early pictures, you'll see that some railroads actually they were sort of pulled by horses. The development that matters to us is the creation of steam power railroads, what become the modern railroads. Now, the first sort of steam power train that we can look at, and some of this is debatable, was created by English engineers, George and Robert Stephenson, in 1830, and they built this locomotive called the Rocket. It actually came out of this competition where they were trying to prove if steam engines could actually work for railroads. Now, the first steam route seems to be a route from Liverpool to Manchester in the UK. It ran at about 35 miles per hour. It weighed 5 or 6 tons and could draw on the flat level, about 40 tons. And it had no brakes. Funny enough, you can actually look at videos online. And there's a couple of videos in my show notes about this where the train itself had no brakes. It would actually just go into reverse, which meant that it would inject steam in the other direction from where it was. And that's what would get the train to stop. Now, this introduction of steam into a train, the ability to have trains powered by steam, was what made the difference. No longer were you just simply pulling a tram with people or with horses. Now you could pull it in a more sort of automatic fashion. Now you could have a longer route. You could carry passengers. You could carry freight. You could do all kinds of things. All you needed was to lay down hundreds and thousands of miles of tracks, which we're going to see every country is going to start to do. And you have this completely new way of transporting goods across the country. Now, in America, John Stevens is considered to be the father of American railroads. In about 1826, Stevens demonstrated the feasibility of a steam locomotion on the circular experimental track in Hoboken, New Jersey, of all places. Now, he did this about 3 years before George Stephenson, released his rocket locomotive. So this is what I'm saying. This can be debatable who invented it, who did it first. The first railroad charter in North America was granted to Stevens himself in 1815. And due to the population of the U.S. at the time, the East Coast became very heavily concentrated with railroads. Now, in America, the construction of railroads followed the sort of classic free market spirit of the nation, right? There were lots and lots of different companies who took on different charters, different sort of segments of the railroads. This is good and bad. Good because it leads to all kinds of expansion, sort of the free market decides where to put railroads, where people put money in, and so on. It's not so much guided by the government. Bad because eventually America will overbuild on railroads and many companies would go bankrupt trying to maintain it. But that being said, for the most part, there's a frenzy of railroad building in America, as in other countries. From about 1860 to 1910, the railroad construction is about 4,000 miles per year. And by the end of the century, end of the 1800s, there's about 200,000 miles of track in the United States. Now, this is really the golden age of railroads, right? There's no really other forms of transportation that can compete just yet. Railroads are the dominant way in which people can move across this vast country, right? You got to remember the scale difference between America and London and France and so on. So railroads are become solid industry in the United States that will transform many things, not just the farmers and Sears, the small little part of the universe we're looking at today. Eventually, railroads will have other competition. There'll be ships and planes and things like that will come on later on. But for now, railroads are without any serious competition. It was said that during this time, really, the railroad the railroad industry is really the sort of the largest single interest in the country. We got to remember, of course, agricultural wealth is a significant part of GDP, but just as an organization, as an industry, there were around 600,000 men who were employed as wage earners. There were perhaps about 2 million human beings, individuals who were dependent upon their daily support from the railways. And here's a fun fact, at this point in time in the end of the 1800s, if you took all the tracks of railroad in the country, in the United States, and you place them continuously, it would reach about halfway to the moon. So you have a lot of tracks being laid down at this point in time. Of course, we saw Richard Sears at the beginning of our story, right? He's a station agent at where? A railroad station. He's seen and benefits from the railroads themselves. The farmers are benefiting from the railroads. So this is a major development that by the time we get to the story, the late 1800s, is well established. Now, here's some numbers here to give you some scale. By 1880, there were about 17,000 freight locomotives. They carry about 23,000 tons of freight and about 22,000 passenger locomotives, right? People moving from. And the railroad industry is the second largest employer, really outside of the agriculture. Now, what we want to remember about the railroads, and today they exist. I mean, we just the other day I got stuck behind a train, right, that was carrying freight. But we got to think about a few things that are taking place at this point in time. The railroads, the trains carry freight, and you can imagine freight as just goods that are being taken from one spot to another. This is the primary way in which individuals and companies are moving things, right? They put them into freight. There's fascinating economics when you have this kind of industry, right? If you think about it, it costs as much to load and unload a train that will haul the freight for 10 miles as one that carries for 1,000 miles. So there's some fixed costs to the freight that we have to keep in mind. And of course, the longer the haul, the less the proportional cost to the carriers, which led to some really intriguing pricing dynamics, right? So the customer who paid the freight, typically at this point in time, it costs the same to load 10 pounds as it did to load 100. So the company, and this is Sears in particular, and many other companies, really exhorted individuals to run the full weight, right? If you're going to pay the same for 10 pounds as you do for 100 pounds, then you should fill out with 100 pounds. And we'll see how Sears uses this sort of pricing quirk to get customers to buy more and more. And actually, we'll see the role of groceries and how Sears uses groceries to try and get customers to buy more. Now, the average charge per mile for each ton of freight was really dropping from about 2 cents to about 1 cent, depending on the route. And it just keeps sort of dropping by the late 1800s. So it's getting cheaper and cheaper to ship goods on freights across the different tracks that are starting to connect ever more towns and cities across the United States. Now, on February 4th, 1887, the Interstate Commerce Act creates what was called at the time the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC. And it was meant to regulate the railroad industry. Actually, railroads became the first industry subject to federal regulation. Now, the act here in question just had some few things. It didn't always make sense. There were some parts that were really contradictory, but it was trying to establish what they call quote-unquote just and reasonable rates. They wanted to prohibit special rates for individual shippers, prohibit preferences in rates for any particular localities or shippers or products, any kind of short versus long haul discrimination, right? We saw how a short haul might cost the same as a long haul earlier. They established a commission of 5 members. And this ICC would actually become the model for many other regulatory agencies that we're going to see later on in the United States. Not in our story, but in the story of the country. But in 1887, this was quite unique. So you can see the weight that the railroad industry had, that it forced the federal government here to intercede and make some kind of regulation. Not quite clear if all this regulation was good or bad. It just was one of the things that the railroad industry had to adapt. Now, the other element I want to mention here, along with the railroads, is the Industrial Revolution is taking place. Of course, starts in England and then comes over to the United States. Now, by the 1900s, the U.S. is the largest manufacturing country in the world, producing twice as England and about 50% of all of Europe combined. Now, part of this is just simply the scale of the country, right? And just how quickly the U.S. is able to ramp up industries, how quickly it's able to lay down tracks once it sort of decides to do it, once sort of the free market starts to do its thing. So all this is providing sort of fertile ground for Sears to come in and offer products. They have this fantastic transportation method that just a few years before did not really exist at the extent it does now. It has a customer, the farmer, who is dissatisfied despite his or her prosperity, in part because of the railroads and in part because of other things that are going on in the country. This boom in the Industrial Revolution. And this is where we can then pick up the story for Sears. So let's go back and let's look at Richard Sears. We left him in Chicago in 1888, selling watches and jewelry with his first catalog. Let's see how this morphs more into the company that we're going to get to know throughout the rest of this story. We laid the foundation. We saw how Richard Sears started selling watches, by luck almost, the role of the railroads, the farmers. Now we're back in Chicago, where we left Sears. Now Richard is continuing to build his company, right? He did very well just sort of selling watches as a station agent. He is continuing to grow his sales, and he has more and more people asking for watch repairs as he has more and more customers who are buying the watches, right? So he's doing a great job selling watches. He has more people asking for watch repairs. And he also realized that profits would be higher if he actually bought the parts and he assembled them himself. So he's trying to figure out, does he continue to partner with manufacturers to get already assembled watches? Does he assemble them himself? What does he do about the sort of watch repairs? Does he want to expand into that? At least to deal with the watch repairs, he decides to hire a repairman. He puts an ad in a newspaper, and the ad just reads, "Wanted, watchmaker with reference who can furnish tools. State age, experience, and salary required." Now, one of the people who responded to this ad was a man named Alva Curtis Roebuck. He interviews with Richard Sears. He gives Richard some samples that Roebuck brought to show him his work. And Sears responds, "I don't know anything about watchmaking, but I presume this is good. Otherwise, you wouldn't have submitted it to me. You look all right, and you may have the position." Now, Roebuck, as you may deduce, is going to become an important element of the story. It's an interesting character, Roebuck. The official name of the company will eventually be called Sears and Roebuck, of course. But he joins Sears as a watchmaker. to help him deal with at least with the watch repairs. Now, this is where the story starts to take some interesting turns. In 1889, now he's been in Chicago for a couple years. Sears, who's 25, decides to sell the company. So he sells R.W. Sears Watch Company for $72,000, which is about $2.5 million today. He's selling this company about 15 months, give or take a few months, after being a quote-unquote sort of poor freight agent back in Minneapolis, as we saw him when he started to sell watches. And he decides to retire to Iowa. It seems Sears had a very strong desire to just live a quiet life. He just wanted to retire to, in this case, Iowa, of all places, and just do nothing. Now, he's 25. You gotta remember this, right? In a matter of a couple years, he just made $2.5 million. Actually, a little bit more, right? Because this is what he sold the company for, plus everything else he sold along the way. So he just made some serious money at a very young age, and he decides to retire. Now, this retirement, and this is the first retirement, does not last long. A few months after this, it might actually be just a few weeks, Sears decides to establish another company. This time he calls it the Warren Company. He actually couldn't use his own name. And about 2 years after this, he sells it when he's 27. Now, in this case, he decides to sell the second company called the Warren Company, which was doing more or less the same thing, right? Selling watches, watch repairs, jewelry, and so on. At 27, 2 years later, he sells his second company in this case, to Roebuck. And by this point, Roebuck, the watch repair that the Sears hired, that sort of owns everything Sears had created, right? And Sears decides to retire a second time. Now, I don't have the amount for how much he sold the second company for, but we can imagine that he once again did quite well, right? Maybe another couple million. He's 27. He retires a second time. And by, this is quote unquote retires. Sears is just sort of having some doubts here, right? Now, a few weeks after he retires a second time, he goes back to Roebuck and he convinces Roebuck to give him back some of the ownership of the company. It's not quite clear how Sears does this. It really seems like Sears was just quite persuasive. Roebuck doesn't seem to be so driven by money. He allows Richard to come back into the company, and Sears once again takes over the company. Now, by the early 1890s, right, we're about 1891 and so on, the catalog the Sears had started originally with just watches now had about 100 pages. It is still mostly watches. But there's some new items. There's some diamonds. There's actually a revolver. And by 1893, the book had 322 pages. So this has become a pretty hefty book, right? And it's becoming a key tool that Sears is using to reach that ideal customer, the farmer that he got to know so well when he was a station agent back in Minneapolis. Now, in 1893, there's some legal changes. The company that Sears took over again, the Warren Company, established itself as a corporation, and the name officially becomes Sears, Roebuck & Co., right? Taking both the names of sort of these key people, Richard Sears, Alva Roebuck, and they release a general catalog, which, again, is not that the first catalog, is just another edition of what they're releasing. Now, in 1893, there's also a panic. There's basically an economic depression, might be the wrong word. I think today we would use the word recession. There was a slowdown in the economy. For Sears, this became a major challenge. It led to a cash squeeze for the company. They had large quantities of unsold merchandise, and they had a really tough cash flow position at this point in time. Another theme we're going to see over and over again as different recessions affect the company, Sears does not really deal well with them. This is not his forte. So in 1895, as Sears is still trying to recover from the panic of 93, they're still short on cash, and Sears decides to sell half of the business for about $75,000 to two gentlemen. One is named Aaron Nussbaum, and the second gentleman is his brother-in-law, and he's called Julius Rosenwald. Now, Nussbaum is not going to be in the business for very long. You'll see he's going to exit stage right very soon, but Rosenwald will be. He will become a critical figure in the life of Sears, especially once Richard is gone. So both of them joined the business, Now, at this point in time, Roebuck decides to quit. And when Roebuck quits, this is actually the half share that Nussbaum and Rosenwald bought actually came from Roebuck. It seems like Roebuck quit primarily just because of the workload, right? You got to remember that when Roebuck joined Sears back in 1887, he quickly found himself working 7 days a week. They were very, very long days. Sears loved this. It's somewhat ironic for someone who just wanted to retire and do nothing. He loved working 12-hour, 14-hour days. But Roebuck was not really into the same lifestyle. So he quits. Rosenwald and Nussbaum get his half share. Funny or maybe sadly enough, the Roebuck stake would eventually be worth millions in later years as Sears grows. But of course, Roebuck, couldn't know that. And it doesn't really seem like Roebuck was motivated for money. Now, Roebuck will come back to Sears in a publicity role in later years, but he doesn't really play a role in the story anymore. He's a bit of an interesting character. His name isn't a company. He seems to have high level of trust with Sears, and Sears himself trusts Roebuck quite a bit. But I don't think it's fair to say it was a partnership. Sears made a lot of the decisions, took a lot of the ownership. He's already decided to sell the company to Nussbaum and Rosenwald. But Roebuck is there. He plays a role in the company, and then he'll come back eventually to the company later on. Now, Rosenwald and Nussbaum become equal partners with Sears, and they really brought calmness into the business. Rosenwald, in particular, would show his operational genius in the coming years, as we'll see soon. And it's a great balance to Sears, who he himself is quite good at driving sales, but very poor at really managing the logistics of the business. Now, here's a fun fact. One of the young friends to Rosenwald is a guy named Henry Goldman, who's going to be, of course, of the future Goldman Sachs company. And Goldman Sachs plays a role in helping Sears go public and other financial elements that the company goes through. Now, let me give you some revenue numbers here for this period that we are looking at. In 1891, Sears made around $137,000 in net sales. In 1892, they doubled this to $276,000. 1893, it went up to about $388,000. 1894, a little bit over to $393,000. Remember, we had the panic of 1893 here, affecting the 1894 year in particular. And in 1895, they doubled once again to $745,000 net sales. This are all, of course, in 1800 numbers. Now, we're in 1885. We want to pause the story here once again because we have to look at something that we haven't yet covered in detail. Sears started to use mail order catalogs from back in 1887 with the watch company when he moved to Chicago after being a station agent. We see that by 1893, this mail order catalog book already had 322 pages, but we haven't really explained it. What is really the mail order catalog, and why did Sears use this channel to dominate the industry? Mail order catalogs had been around for some time when Sears started to use them. The first mail order catalog was called the Tiffany's Blue Book, which Tiffany, the jeweler, established in 1845. It's actually still being released in 2023. I'm not sure if Tiffany actually sends physical books anymore, but if you go online, you can actually look up the Tiffany's Blue Book today, and it has, of course, relevant products. So Tiffany started with the first mail order catalog. There were several in Europe. It kind of goes back to England, and there's some roots in Venice. Just the idea of being able to send a book with products and people could buy from those books. Now, Tiffany did not really have a wide adoption of its catalog. Luxury goods at this time were really not accessible to most people, especially most farmers. So did not have the same level of penetration that Sears will eventually go on to have. If we look at retail as a whole, again, retailers exist. We have the rural merchants, which we looked at briefly when we talked about the farmers. The cities themselves, cities like Chicago and so on, had retailers. Macy's and so on already existed. But something that stands out about the retailers is that it has always historically cost more to distribute goods than to manufacture. And the largest part of the cost of distribution is incurred in the retailing process. So a retailer like Macy's, which already has stores in many cities, has to pay a lot of costs just for being able to maintain the stores, be able to maintain the storefronts and different parts. Mail order would become a way to reduce this retailing costs. And Sears would really use them to its advantage. All of a sudden, Sears could sell all kinds of products at a crazy amount of volume, especially when you compare it to other retailers like Macy's, without a storefront. It could do it with a book, a physical book, pages, paper, right? So that was what mail order catalogs would allow Sears to do. Now, if we want to look at the specific companies that are more relevant to Sears, we have to start with one called E.C. Allen of Augusta, Maine. This is really perhaps the first exclusive mail order in the United States. It started in Maine, as you can imagine. He started this short book with specialties for like recipes for washing powder and engravings, chromos, novelties, and so on. And this happened about 1870. His success led to a lot of imitation, right? One of the perhaps challenges with the mail order business is that it's quite easy to get started. After all, you just print in the book, right? So Allen of Augusta, Maine can be the first success, led to a lot of competitors. They continue to be a presence, though we're not going to see it too much in our story. Augusta, Maine actually would become one of the most important mail order centers in the United States in the near future. The first organization that we do have to look at in detail is Montgomery Ward. And Montgomery Ward is really very similar to Sears. We're going to see it come in and out of our story. It started in 1872. So if you remember, Sears was about maybe 12 years old when Montgomery Ward started, and it made a serious impact. So Montgomery Ward really knew farmers and their needs. It started in Chicago with a single sheet of 8 by 12. It eventually grew to 72 pages by 1874. And one of the things that made Montgomery Ward stand out in this era is it became the official partner of an organization called the Order of the Patrons of Husbandry, better known as the Grange. This was really an advocacy group in modern terms, maybe an association if we want to use terms today. But this group, the Grange, was really designed to help farmers get more support or have more leverage in their industries. So Montgomery Ward became the partner of the Grange, and that gave them a lot of legitimacy with farmers. Now, Montgomery Ward introduced many things that we're going to see later on in mail order as a key for Sears' success. One was the guarantee. So they knew that when a farmer opened the Montgomery Ward book, the mail order catalog, they needed to have some kind of guarantee that the product that was in front of them on paper would be the same that would arrive in a physical form. So the guarantee took many forms. Montgomery Ward really played around with this idea of subject to examination, which Sears also used. The idea was simple. You as a customer, as a farmer, you could order something from the mail order catalog from Montgomery Ward. You wouldn't pay for it. The shipping cost would be paid by Ward. And if you liked it, if it followed what you expected, then you would send the money back to Ward. So this idea of no shipping costs, inspect before you buy, is going to become one of the ways that they would guarantee products the farmers will feel more comfortable buying from a company and from a store they have never seen. They also did all kinds of marketing that Sears will eventually adopt, right? They would advertise in other mail order periodicals, farmer almanacs. They would have this sort of brainstorming railroad cards, which I think is really interesting. They would sort of fill a railroad card and then have all kinds of products. And then, that car will go to different towns and farmers will go and see the product. So it wasn't completely just off the mail order catalog itself. So Montgomery Ward is really sort of pioneering a lot of these elements in America, working with farmers. But eventually they will be eclipsed by Sears, just for many of the same reasons that Sears were going to dominate. Now, retail stores rose almost around the same time as sort of mail order catalogs. Macy's actually had its own mail order catalog in 1874, but it seems like for retailers like Macy's, they can never really make the split work. They could never really know if they were a mail order business or they were a retailer, and often they chose to be retailers instead of mail order. So they didn't really compete with Sears in the same way, even though they had perhaps a good brand and an established network of stores. Now, there were all kinds of mail order businesses at the time. Most really just sold a single line of goods, and very few sold exclusively by mail. For example, Montgomery Ward being one example that was an exclusive mail order business, as Sears would go on to be. Macy's actually entered the mail order business about 12 years before Sears, but they abandoned it by 1911, just as the mail order business would go on to grow into the golden age, as we'll see when we get to about 1912 in our story. What's intriguing about Macy's, and perhaps what Macy's never really competed with Sears, is they seem to be a little out of touch with farmers. You gotta remember, farmers were skeptical of city folks, perhaps seeing them as somewhat elitist, and Macy's did not do a good job at pushing back against this narrative. Department stores typically require fast changing stock. That is, the stock in the stores actually had to change quickly, but the mail order catalogs needed to be a little bit more stagnant, for a better word. You ship this book, and a farmer needed to be able to look at the book maybe 3 months after they got it and know that they can still order the same product. But retailers did not really function in that same way. And of course, the prices that Macy's offered were not lower than the stores. So competitors like Macy's are in the background to our story, but they do not really compete with Sears. Montgomery Ward does, and we'll see this come back. Now, there were some elements that made mail order catalog particularly popular in the 1800s. One of them is the introduction of something that was called Rural Free Delivery, RFD. RFD started in 1896. Now, cities had free home delivery before 1896, but before RFD, rural inhabitants, farmers, had to pick up mail themselves at sort of distant post offices. Remember, right? The farmers might live an hour away from sort of the town center. They could also pay express companies for delivery, but that of course would be more expensive. So free mail delivery started in the cities about 1863, but it took more than 20 years before it arrived in rural locations. In the Grange that we saw before, the advocacy group had a big part here as they lobby for this to be passed by Congress. The farmers actually started to put out boxes for rural carriers, and this is the precursor to the mailboxes. And there was everything from sort of lard pails to syrup cans to old Apple soap and cigarette boxes. And of course, by 1902, there were the official mailboxes that we see today that were established. Now, the RFD system would eventually be supplemented by parcel posts in about 1912. This will be a major development for Sears. We won't get into the full details right now. We'll cover them when we get to the story. For now, the rural free delivery is allowing farmers to receive things straight to their home. Now, the packages are small, and they're not really packages, but they could receive the catalog at their home directly. That was perhaps the key element to remember from this rural free delivery. Now, here's how the mail order process would work for a customer, right? A customer would receive a catalog, and for many years, that would be free. Sears and Montgomery Ward would experiment with charging for the catalog, but generally, they realized it had to be free. So the customer would receive the catalog, and after the rural free delivery, the farmer could receive the catalog straight to their house. They would then go through the book, look at what they wanted, and they would send an order by letter, simply write in what they wanted. Companies like Sears would have special forms that farmers could use if they wanted to, but they also just accepted just plain letters that you could write on a sort of blank piece of paper, with a few words. The company, like Sears, would receive and process the order. They would mail it back to the farmer. This will be mailed back through freight, what we saw before, to a station, right? Remember, as Sears was a station agent. The customer would then go to the station to pick up the package. If they were satisfied with the package, then the payment could be done. In some cases, the payment could be done before the package was sent, but being able to send a package without paying was a major, major advantage for mail order companies. So that was the general process, right? And the catalog would have a lot of different pages. We see there's hundreds of pages in the examples, even at this young place in our story. Now, let's take a look at the Sears catalog. Now, in my hands, I actually have a replica of the 1897 catalog the Sears put out. Now, we're not quite there in the story. We stopped about 1895, where we left Sears off right after, Roebuck exited, and they brought Rosenwald and Nussbaum. But the 1887 is pretty close to what the Sears catalog would go on to be. And I got to tell you, this is quite a thing. The whole thing is black and white, as you can imagine. There is about 700 plus pages of this catalog. And I want to just read a few things here for you so you understand how farmers also actually use this catalog. Now, farmers would read catalogs from cover to cover, right? And that was really the intent, and where Sears really shined with his ability to write copy that people just wanted to read, right? Here in the first page, I see the title 1897, the Sears Roebuck catalog. We see Sears Roebuck and Co., right? The corporation name we saw before. The cheapest supply house on earth, right? Sears loved to be bold and in some cases maybe exaggerate what they did. This is catalog number 104. A lot of times, actually, the catalog was referred to as the consumer's guide with a specific number. And you just had to make a note when you order to note the number of catalog that you were ordering from. Many farmers had multiple catalogs, and Sears would go on to issue catalogs primarily twice a year in the spring and the fall, but there were other special editions that were used over and over again. So let me read here for you, right? So it says, to our friends and patron, throughout the agency of Uncle Sam's Mail, we again greet you with the latest edition of our catalog, The Consumer's Guide, number 104. And we wish to thank our many friends and patrons for the very liberal patronage accorded us during the past season. Your patronage has been so very liberal, this has been capitalized and highlighted, that our business has grown beyond our most sanguine expectations. In fact, we honestly believe that the remarkable growth of our business is without a parallel in the history of mercantile concerns. Maybe true, maybe not. We can assure you that your trade has been greatly appreciated. This is all in capitals. And at no time have we been blind to the great responsibility taken in the endeavor to fill promptly the thousands of other orders and answer the thousands of inquiries that reach us daily. We have spared neither time nor money to care for our customers' every want. It has been our constant aim to so please every customer that he will become our friend, and as a friend, will use his kind influence among his friends and neighbors in our behalf. Again, we see this play out in our story all the time. The very remarkable growth of our business is the most satisfactory proof to us that we have succeeded. And yet, at times, the volume of business offered us by our country friends has been almost beyond our maximum capacity. But experience has taught us that it is safe to anticipate the wants of our customers. Experience has taught us that the people throughout the length and breadth of the land are anxious to give their material support to a house where they can buy their goods at wholesale prices, capitalized, where they can send their orders and their money with the positive assurance that they will be treated in exactly the same way as we would like to be treated were we in their place. The thousands of unsolicited testimonials which reach us from the prominent people in every state and every territory, the flattering notices which appear in the press, the very apparent increase in the number of orders we receive each succeeding month demonstrate to us beyond any question of doubt that we have the confidence of our customers, that they are in favor of this method of merchandising, that they are using their influence everywhere in our behalf, and in consequence of this assurance, we are making very extensive preparations for the future. And though pointing to the past with no little pride, for the future, we can safely assure you even better values, promoter shipments, and we believe such treatment in general as can be secure from no other concern. So this is just the first page. We turn the page here. The first few pages have all kinds of policies here. So it tells you, we employ no agents, right? By the aid of our customers' catalogs, our customers can deal with us direct. Thus, the farmer, miner, mechanic, businessman, in fact, anyone can send in his or her own order and save money. So what Richard did as a station agent is something Sears is actually moving away as a company. You can deal directly with the company. Our terms are alike to all. Our employees are instructed to treat every customer and at a distance exactly as they would like to be treated, right? So this is all copy that the Sears has written. And he's a master copywriter. And I'll talk about the principles here in a second. But he's highlighting things. He's capitalizing the things that he thinks are the most important. It is telling you here to freight and express rates are usually low. Again, the first 3-4 pages are simply explaining how to send the money, how to order, what are the free samples, how to return goods. There's discounts for cash and so on. There's some mistakes. I love this. I actually love this invitation here. This is about the 5th page. There's actually no page numbers in this in this catalog, but there's what I think is the 5th page. It says in big letters, "You are invited to come and see us. If you ever come to Chicago, tell your friends. Coming to Chicago to call and see us. Make our store your headquarters while in the city. We will try and make it pleasant for you. You will not be asked to buy. Be gentlemanly ushers will show you through our house, and we feel sure you will be interested in seeing how a great mail order business is conducted, how 10,000 to 20,000 letters are disposed of daily, and many thousands of packages dispatched each day. Anyone can direct you to our store. 3 car lines pass our doors. We are located at the corner of Fulton, Des Plaines, and Waymar streets. Our building is our largest 4 blocks around. You can't miss it. You will always be made welcome here. Greatest mail order house on earth." Now, Sears then goes on to, there's a page here all about what the bankers say. So these are actually short letters from different banks to Sears. For example, the National Bank of Illinois here, and it's saying, the stockholders of the firm of Sears, Roebuck & Co. are personally known to us, and we take pleasure in stating that from our experience, the concern is a reputable one and thoroughly responsible. They keep a very desirable account with us. Again, Sears is just trying to have all kinds of social proof here to help customers or farmers feel reassured that they're going to be ordering from a legitimate business. Even when Sears becomes a major store, they still do this. Thousands of testimonials, banker notes. In the first pages, they're trying to showcase that they have thousands of orders, this huge business in Chicago, this huge building, everything for the social proof. Now we get here to groceries, which is very unique. Sears was actually shipping groceries to the farmers by freight. And we have all kinds of things here. There's coffee. This is a whole page of coffee. Then we have beverages. We have root beer. We have extracts, candy. So let me kind of fast forward here a little bit, just to some random pages. Here's a page on sauce, back sauce, compass sauce, keyhole sauce. So by this point, Sears was clearly expanding beyond just watches, right? And fast forward again, another maybe 100 pages. There's all kinds of shoes. I'll read here in the sample for you. This is a man's heavy rolled edge Arctics, number 31304, man's extra heavy buckle Arctic, wool line with heavy rolled edge protection and the uppers and the extra heavy sole and heel. First quality only, sizes 6 to 13, full width, price per pair, $1.45. We'll fast forward again. Here's actually the page of gold and silver. So they have all kinds of sort of little jewelry. Let's keep forward here. Here's cameras. This is called the Ideal camera, a reversible back. Number 6540. The Ideal camera is one of the best view cameras ever placed on the market. It is made of selected mahogany, is finished in the best possible style, every part being as nearly perfect as possible. All metal parts are made of brass, polish, and lacquer. The perfection of this camera is a result of much study and many experiments and is favorable for both professional and amateur photography. It has a reversible back with spring actuating ground glass frame by which the plate holder is inserted between the ground glass and the camera back. The bellows are cone-shaped, but the 5x7 and all sizes above are made with fronts wide enough for stereoscopic lens. By using a very simple method of attaching the horizontal swing, it takes up no more room than does the single swing. This bed has 2 joints, which admit of the use of lenses of short focus. Sizes up to and including 6.5 by 8.5 are made the same as the above engraving, but sizes 8 by 10 to 11 versus 14 inclusive are made similar to the Empire State. The 14 by 7 and larger are made with black focus and with focus and handle instead of rack and pinion. Again, lots of detail, right? He's trying to give farmers all the detail they will ever need if they want to buy this camera. They want to give social proof. Again, here's a page on revolvers, fish hooks, and so on. So this is incredible, and it's quirky because there's no appendix. So Sears didn't want people to be able to fast forward to specific pages. So if you want to look for revolvers, he didn't want you to say, okay, let me go to the appendix, or let me look at the table of contents. I see revolvers are on page 250. Let me go there. He wanted farmers and customers to read this page by page, cover to cover. So there were all kinds of things that weren't added to catalogs that would make them easier to traverse, but that was not the point of it. The pages too, every single spot on the page is being used. He hated white space. So there's lots of text. It is cram, might be the words we would use today. But that's just what he wanted, right? He wanted to fit in as much as possible, as much copy and text as possible. At the very end, there's some testimonials. I think one catalog, not sure if it's this one, actually had about 55 pages of testimonials just crammed in, just to, again, show how reliable Sears was. Something intriguing about Sears is he really thought that mail order was a fleeting phenomenon in the merchandising world, and that it would only survive as long as it was being dramatized and exploited with electrifying schemes. So you see this a lot in the early catalogs that Sears wrote and managed himself. It's over the top. It's exciting. It's meant to be dramatic, because he really thought that if you didn't do that, if you weren't putting serious money and mailing thousands and thousands of catalogs, the whole model will not work. In a way, he was right. Eventually the mail order catalog will no longer be around, right? Sears will move away from it and actually go into retail stores in 1925. But at this point in time, this is the age in which Sears is making this catalog this amazing selling book, right? A single small book that a farmer can use to buy everything they want. I have here a page for suits. These are ladies' suits, and there's a few pictures of the suits themselves, black and white, of course. There's children's jackets, men's suits, and so on. I'm actually going to do a short video of this catalog and include it in some bonus content that I think I'll release later on, so you get to see it. Now, Sears was a fantastic copywriter. And keep in mind that I'm still using Sears synonymous with the company itself, right? When I say Sears, I'm still talking about Richard Sears. He's still around. Eventually, that will no longer be the case, but at this point in time, he is the company. He is single-handedly managing this catalog himself. He's writing all the copy, and even when he gets people to help him, he overlooks a lot of it. This is his baby. Now, he violated every rule in the books for copywriting. He never lied in with white space. He crammed every inch with tightly packed up copy. He sort of motorized in his illustrations to conserve every drop of space. He was determined to counterbalance his sort of lack of technical knowledge by writing messages that were so compelling that farmers would read through the last line, and most did, right? Most professional advertising people today might be sort of aghast at the way Sears wrote these ads. But for Sears, for Richard, the true benchmark of success was the number of orders that he received. That's really what he looked at when he measured the success of the catalog and his copy and everything he did. He didn't care about best practices or if this was right, or even in some cases if it was sort of appropriate to be describing some products in a certain way, which would eventually hurt Sears. He really just loved seeing orders come in. Some of the examples I read here, right? They had lots of detail. They had lots of repetition of the same ideas. Very slight editing, actually. Sears, once he wrote it, he was sort of ready to go. He wanted to see how many orders it drove, and if it didn't drive orders, he got rid of it or he changed it. Very simple language too in a lot of this, right? The national vocabulary at the time and even today really sort of tends towards simplification. So the catalog follows suit. So copywriters, when Sears didn't do all the writing himself, they were instructed that they shouldn't say sweat, or that they should say sweat and not perspiration. They should say go to bed, not retire. Food, not nutrition. Tears, not lacrimal secretions. Men and women instead of ladies and gents. Sears believed that there was no room for jokes. He wanted to describe things as factually as he could. And, facts was a loose concept with Sears. He wanted to provide facts, but facts that were appealing to the farmers. But he didn't do any jokes in this copy. He thought that was just a waste of space. And really, Sears himself as a salesperson, as a copywriter, which is contagious. There's a story where he goes and tries to find suits. So he goes to a suit manufacturer and he asks for 50 suits. And the manufacturer is just aghast. He said, "Wait, me 50 suits? So don't you want to start with something less? How are you going to sell 50 suits?" And Sears responds, "Sell them. They were sold already." And, of course, he eventually got the manufacturer to provide more suits because they were selling upwards of 9,000 suits per day when they added to the catalog. And he became increasingly bolder in his promising. He would say that something will last forever, that it will never break, that it was the best of its kind, unique. Henry Goldman, which we saw earlier, right, from Goldman and Sachs, he really summed it up. And he said that, quote, "I think he could sell a breath of air." So Sears is clearly a fantastic salesman. We saw that ever since he was a station agent in Minneapolis with the watches. He eventually got his catalog, and the catalog was just his domain, his realm. He controlled everything. He wrote it. He chose the products, and he just loved seeing the orders come in. Now, the Sears strategy for selecting products, at least how Richard approached it, was really quite simple. He was not an innovator when choosing products. He would notice a trend. For example, he would notice that bicycles were becoming more popular. He would then contract with a manufacturer to get bicycles, ideally in large quantities, and then he would find a way to slash the price. So if a bicycle was retailing for $75, he would find a way to be able to sell that in the catalog for $5 or $10 or $15. And then he would advertise profusely. That's it. Notice the trend, get a manufacturer, slash the price down, and advertise heavily. And he just did this over and over again. So he was jumping on trends once they became popular. He was trying to find products that he knew were already going to sell, find ways to really drive those prices down, and then just blast the market with advertising. In these catalogs, we also start to see the playing around with the guarantee. This is something that Sears really played around a lot with. We saw that Montgomery Ward has his guarantee that it was subject to examination, and if it wasn't what you expected, you could sell it, you could send it back. The company would pay the shipping costs. So Sears did a lot around this as well. He played along with the copy for the guarantee. It really evolved from trying to guarantee the quality to eventually guarantee everything. He would offer money refunds even a year after purchase. There's a lot of different language around the guarantee that Sears played with and how far he would go for this. So he wasn't just trying to scam farmers and get them to buy. He wanted repeat customers. And he was trying to find the best way to decrease the friction that you had. Imagine a farmer gets this in their mail. He's reading the copy. He might be enticed, but does he trust the company? Is he really going to get what he expects? So Sears thought about this a lot. There were some offers that Sears played around with that I think would be worth mentioning too. He had this sort of something for nothing. He would do this promotion where you can mail in your name and you would get a prize. So everyone would get some kind of prize. It might be a small trinket. The campaign might offer like a big thing, like a piano that you would get for free. And you would mail in to get a special catalog for it. So this is just almost like I guess we might call it like a competition today. Just almost like a giveaway of some sort. So he experimented with that. Another offer he played around with is special catalogs. For example, he would advertise a sewing machine at a ridiculously low price. Let's say $5, when everyone knew that sewing machines retail for at least $25. And what he was trying to do is get people to request a special sewing machine catalog. So this is different from the one in my hands, right? The one in my hand has 700 pages, multiple products. Sears would then experiment with creating smaller catalogs for just specific products. So perhaps it's a sewing machine catalog of 50 pages of just sewing machines. And someone would send a letter to get the special catalog. He would call this sort of like an inquiry getter. They would be enticed by this ridiculously low-priced sewing machine. But when they got the sewing machine catalog, they would see that there were, of course, other products. And he would hope that people would go for them with the more higher-priced sewing machines. So he did this over and over again. Try to build, I guess, what marketing people today might call like a funnel. Get people to show interest and then reward that interest with something specific. He also created, not at this point in time, but later on, in fact, an affiliate scheme. he started this in Iowa and it became the Iowa Station technique. But he would then distribute catalogs to people and then offer a reward. Maybe it could be an actual product, let's say like a bicycle, and he would get people to then sell for him. So you got catalogs as a farmer. Let's say you got 20. And if you got 19 of those catalogs into the hands of your neighbors and they order, then you would get a reward. You would get the bicycle back on the mail as your reward for getting other people to order from the catalogs. So this Iowa Station was something he used a lot to be able to get effectively affiliates to get the catalogs into the hands of other people. And again, to also increase that social proof, it was no longer Sears requesting your order, it was your neighbor farmer. So there were all kinds of offers and things that he played around with in the copy. It's also important to note that, farmers had a huge trust in Sears. On the first page of his catalog, Sears' friendly message was really meant to win farmers over. He would say something like, "Don't be afraid that you will make a mistake. We receive hundreds of orders every day from young and old who never before sent away for goods. We are accustomed to handling all kinds of orders. Tell us what you want in your own way, written in any language, no matter whether good or poor writing, and the goods will be promptly sent to you." We talked about the details of the order, right? So he would tell them, you can use our order blank if you have one. If you haven't, use any plain paper. Tell us in your own way what you want. And of course, finally, if you live on a rural mail route, just give the letter and money to the mail carrier and he will get the money order at the post office and mail it in the letter for you. So he had all kinds of hand-holding for the farmers, trying to ensure they wouldn't feel self-conscious. Some farmers were literate, but they perhaps didn't write or the writing was not legible. But no matter what, Sears wanted to make them feel okay about sending the order in, right? And he was trying to really build Sears on three principles. Sears was an honest merchant. You could see the good before buying, and they had low prices. Low price in particular is going to become a major element that Sears promotes, that they had low prices. So this is how we got to the mail order catalogs. It became one of the most direct ways of reaching the farmers. And for Sears in particular, he was very, very skilled at writing copy and getting people to buy from just paper, right? Just be able to look at paper and pictures in a few sentences. That's really all Sears needed to get people to send in thousands and thousands of orders. Now that we explained mail order catalogs, let's really pick up the Sears story and go all the way to 1925. Now, we left Sears at 1895, right after selling half the stake after Roebuck left, and Rosenwald and Nussbaum joined in as business partners. Now, they were in a tough cash flow position before Rosenwald and Nussbaum joined in, so let's pick up and see where Sears is at right now. So we are back in 1895. Now, Nussbaum joined in, but from the very beginning, there were conflicts between Nussbaum and Sears, and even between Nussbaum and Rosenwald. Eventually, Nussbaum is bought out for $1.3 million at the time, which is about $46 million today in 1903. Remember that Roebuck sold his stake in about 1895, and Rosenwald and Nussbaum came in for about $75,000. So a few years, and Roebuck would have made some serious money. Again, not really what he cared about, but just interesting to note. So Rosenbaum is out, and we're left with Sears and Rosenwald. Now, Sears loved to drive sales. We saw that earlier in the mail order catalog section. So he loved it. He loved to just see this avalanche of orders come in. And many times he drove so many sales that it nearly bankrupted the company. One example is suits. He got a manufacturer to prepare men's suits, but it turns out the men's suits were very difficult to order by mail. You had to not only order the suit, you had to send in your measurements. Then the suit had to be modified and then sent back to the customer. If it didn't fit well, then the customer would send it back. It was a huge ordeal. But again, Sears just loved it. He just thought he was amazing at driving sales. But from a logistical perspective, it was very, very tough. And this is where Rosenwald really came into conflict with Sears himself. How to manage the volume. Rosenwald wanted Sears to slow down, to be more deliberate in the product choices, to avoid things like suits, which were going to be very difficult to pull off. And Sears just would not hear it. So many of the financial issues, apart from the economic challenges, like we saw in the Panic of 1893, were not just external. They were sometimes driven internally by Sears if we're being honest, incredible ability to drive sales, but little thought being given to the logistics or the operations. So he's to him, the sort of the orders lying in vast confusion were just a mute testimony to the power of his advertising. Now, let me give you some numbers here, just so you see what Sears was trying to deal on the operation side. The early shift, before the shift that came in to pack the orders, they opened about 27,000 letters by this point in time, late 1890s. And they had to then estimate the different products that had to go in it. During October and November, and the sort of 2 weeks in December, there's about 100,000 pieces of mail every day. The largest mail is received on Monday morning, and on Monday itself it might be 100,000 pieces of mail, and all the mail has to be open on schedule. All the work has been on schedule. Once the mail is open, it has to be read. Right? Remember, the farmers are sending letters in, which may be legible, maybe not. Then they have to figure out what different products are needed from different sections in the company, different buyers. It might be a product for, it might be a revolver, and it might be a suit. So you have to figure that out. Then it has to get packaged and then shipped back on the railroads and so on. So it's logistically, it's a very, very difficult business. A fun fact, Henry Ford actually inspected the assembly line that would eventually be built mostly by Rosenwald, and it will have an influence on what Ford would do with his own company. So Sears started to build this incredible assembly line of products to be able to manage this crazy demand that Sears was just driving through his advertising, through his mail order catalog. Now, along the way, they also started to diversify. We saw that with that 1897 catalog, right? There's all kinds of products. They also introduced the idea of loss leaders. And perhaps one of the most common or the most well-known loss leaders was groceries. I was actually surprised to know that Sears was shipping groceries by railroad in the late 1800s. They actually appear in 1896 for the very first time in the spring catalog. They occupy about 10 pages. And the logic for groceries was twofold. We saw before how the minimum freight charge was based on 100 pounds. Since customers would eventually pay the freight, that is, if they kept the products, if they didn't return them, they would pay the freight cost. They were motivated to be able to run that to 100 pounds whenever possible. So groceries will make it easier to do that. They could buy a revolver, they could buy a suit, they could buy a camera, and they could then fill out the rest of their order with groceries. The second factor was that while groceries were not really profitable in themselves, they allowed them to secure some customers who might go to another competitor just for groceries. So they wanted to offer it as a way to keep customers in the same universe of Sears. And farmers in particular really liked this groceries. They lived in isolated areas. The rural merchants, as we mentioned before, may not have the same options as someone like Sears might. So groceries became this loss leader element for Sears. Again, we see that it's very difficult to do. They were not expecting profits, but nonetheless, it was something that Sears started to offer quite a bit. Now, the Sears customer service was also quite legendary. So despite this massive inbound of mail and letters and so on, they had customer stories that became legends, right? So let me read a couple of the stories for you. There was once an Ohio customer who complained that his son ran into a tree and broke his leg when the brake of a Sears bicycle he was riding failed to work. The boy's father wrote that the local doctor said the lad's broken bone improperly, with the result that the boy was apparently going to be lame for life. I guess, he would have a limp of sorts. Richard Sears asked no questions. He had the man bring his son to Chicago, where a well-known surgeon reset the bone of the boy's leg, of course, at the company's expense. One story. Another story. At another occasion, Sears, strolling through the plant, saw one of his guides showing a man and a wife and their 2 children around. The guide was waving his lantern about in search of something. Upon questioning, the man told Sears that he thought he had lost a $5 bill in his tour of the plant. Sears forthwith handed the man $5 from his own pocket with the assurance that he did not want any friends losing money in Sears' Roebuck's plant. The man was finally persuaded to accept the money over his own protestations that Sears should not feel responsible for someone else's carelessness. Now, this third one is my favorite story. A conductor helping a lady off a streetcar on which Sears was riding dropped his watch on the pavement where it was badly smashed. Seeing the man's chagrin, Sears asked where he had purchased the watch. The answer was Sears, Roebuck. Sears had the conductor come down to the plant where he was given a new watch for free. Sears reportedly told them, quote, "We guarantee our watches not to fall out of people's pockets and break." So again, just legendary customer stories that Sears emphasized, of course, in his catalog, in the advertising, and the copy. It reminds me a lot of Nordstrom, who had sort of was known for a lot of this sort of crazy stories as well. But it was clear that the Sears was using it as a way to build social proof, remind farmers, all the kind of stuff, right? He's thinking about advertising. This is really what Sears is all about. How do you get more sales? What can you do to drive more sales? Now, let's look at the catalog circulation here from about 1902 to 1908. We can see that in 1902, there were about 600,000 catalogs being circulated. And by 1908, that number is about 2 million and a bit. So we see this constant increase in catalogs being circulated and sent to farmers, to customers. Sears is trying to get as many as this catalogs in the hands of people. I mentioned before in the previous section that the Sears really jumped on trends. Some of the trends that they jumped on were for example, patent medications. These were actually just medicines. A lot of them seem to be quite sketchy. It's what we might call today alternative medicine, but they were promoted quite heavily by Sears for some time. There were 2, 4, 6, 8 cent stores. These are just precursors to the modern dollar stores. Modern homes, which is also a well-known Sears product. That is, Sears shipped entire homes to be assembled by the customers. There's some pictures, actually, I'm going to include the bonus content, and you can go online and look this up. Some of these homes are still standing today, and they're quite nice. They look like sort of single houses, but Sears sold this. Modern homes was a little difficult. We'll see this a little later on as it plays a bigger role in the later part of our story. But yes, Sears sold entire homes by mail, right? Automobiles. So Sears actually had established automobiles in 1906. It seems like, again, they work with manufacturers to do this. They weren't really that successful, and definitely not as successful as Ford would become. But Sears saw the trend as automobiles became popular, and they jumped on it. Now, all through this time, we're in the early 1900s now. Price is paramount. In relationship to quality, though, we have to remember that Sears was striving to give low prices to farmers while maintaining a certain level of quality. But the quality was really in the eye of the beholder, right? The quality of a $5 watch may not be the same as a $25 watch, but farmers were happy, and that's really what Sears care about. It is said here that the best gold watch that Sears had only really had about 27 cents worth of gold, but it kept time for decades, so it sort of kept working. And a suit that maybe sold for $4.98 was at least 50% or more less than other suits. The quality was actually quite shoddy, but where else could farmers buy a suit for $5? And when we see the returns that Sears got, even though there were lots of returns, there were always lots of happy customers. So some people kind of give Sears crap for some of the quality they were selling, but the customers were happy. By far and large, the customers were happy, and there were more happy customers than not happy customers. And that's really how Sears thought about quality and price. Now, we have to note here magazines, which became a key advertising channel for Sears. Between 1880 and 1890, their number increased by about 93%, and the average circulation increased by 50%. So it was just a way of reaching the public. There were all kinds of magazines that were established around this time that people would read. Again, remember, right? Farmers wanted lots of reading materials. So Sears would use these magazines for advertising. So he would put ads in the magazine where people would respond to the ads, and it would get a catalog, and then it would start that sort of funnel that we talked about earlier. Magazines like Cosmopolitan started around this time and became really popular. So Sears, again, jumping on these early trends for where to advertise and how to reach customers. Let's also look at manufacturers here for a second at this time. We know that Sears has been partnering with manufacturers, a bicycle manufacturer or something like that. But Sears also had different things. This buying organization that Sears had by this point, right? The catalog I had in my hands from 1897 already has 700 pages, thousands of products. So this organization of buyers that Sears had internally was really reaching into every resource in the United States. And in fact, over the civilized world, really. They did thorough research into the proper time, place, and way of buying staple raw materials. they're described as a great college of commercial economies, and this buying organization is how they're able to get all kinds of products at the right prices and things that may not be available in shops. Now, many manufacturers fear being stuck with Sears as a sole customer. You can imagine that you make bicycles, Sears comes, and then all of a sudden they become your main customer. So huge orders, sort of 50,000 products, might be too much for a single manufacturer. So Sears was always wary about this, and they're trying to find the right way to partner with manufacturers. One of the things they started to do is actually lend money to them. So there was a shotgun manufacturer that Sears came to. They were producing about 15 shotguns per day. Sears gave them money, and that allowed them to increase the production to 200 shotguns a day. Of course, the majority of this capacity went to Sears, right? And the same thing was done with revolvers and all kinds of products. Sears will also set up their own manufacturing facilities to maintain demand. We'll see this a little bit later on, but they will eventually have maybe 14 or 20 different manufacturers where they were at least a 50% owner in the business itself. This is especially true for the most important products. Now, there was some boycotting by this point. Sears was buying so many things at such a big level that some outlets would try to boycott Sears, some manufacturers tried to boycott Sears. So Sears had to constantly figure out how to get the products they needed while dealing with all this pushback. Now, some notes about the employees. It looks like, on average, people would be working 60-hour work weeks and maybe more. Richard, of course, himself, he worked from 8 a.m. to 11 p.m. He loved working. For a guy that tried to retire twice in his 20s, this guy loved to work. The conditions in Sears seem to be normal, right? Not great, not bad. They had some interesting perks, some health and savings accounts. They had a campus, which we'll see later on. So Sears was sort of doing its best with working conditions. Again, they don't stand out as being innovators in this area, but they sort of did their best for the times. In 1906, the company goes public with a stock placement of about $40 million. That's about $1.5 billion today. And their 1906 IPO is actually really the first major retail IPO in American financial history and really represents a coming of age, at least financially, of the consumer sector. So the 1906 IPO for Sears is of course fantastic. It gives cash to a company that needs cash, and it's just a big milestone for the company. Now let's see how retailers are reacting to Sears, right? The rural merchants and so on. We need to remember that Sears, and if you look at this book I just looked at, the 1897 catalog, was listing approximately 100,000 items of merchandise by 1908. You can see just how heavily engaged in competition Sears was. It was competing in virtually every shoe store in smaller communities. It competed with grocery stores. It competed with farm implement salesmen. It was competing with a lot of people, which is this one book, right? Clothing stores, bookstores, distributors. There were really few communities of any size, few stores, even at the country crossroads, where the mail order firm did not find itself competing. Now, this competition would lead to a lot of things, right? A lot of pushback from a lot of people. A lot of try to push back for the government to regulate and help the retailers. Now, what's important to know here is that these retailers, they will eventually win in the future. The rise of cars, better roads, motion pictures, improved communications like the telephone would eventually defeat the mail order catalog. But in our time, in this story, the mail order catalog would stand against all of these retailers, all of these different interests. Some of the things the retailers did were quite questionable. For example, they actually claimed that Sears and Roebuck were Negroes, right? So racism was still quite prevalent in the U.S. at this time. Sears responded to this by actually sending color pictures of Richard himself. Again, the catalog was mostly black and white, but they would strive to send color pictures to try to reinforce the fact that they were not African American. Some small town retailers would pay 10 cents or give a free movie entrance for anyone who brought a catalog for destruction. They would actually burn these catalogs in this sort of like big pit of fire. Small retailers will argue that local businesses, the rural merchants, they actually pay local taxes. They support the community. Sears would be sued by local towns, all kinds of things, right? And Sears would actually write this very brilliant letter arguing why local merchants charge more. Now, let me read here something for you. Richard Sears wrote this as a way to push back against all this opposition from the small retailers and the many organizations who were against Sears. Now, he remember, was a fantastic copywriter. So he wrote this incredible letter, which is titled Our Compliments to the Retail Merchant. It's really a masterpiece. Let me read that for you. The retail merchant fills an important place in commerce, in that he is a necessary agent for the distribution of all kinds of merchandise to the convenience of the customer everywhere. Very rarely the country merchant who sells you dry goods, shoes, hardware, and other merchandise overcharges you. As a rule, the merchant from whom you buy adds as little profit to the cost of the goods as he can possibly afford to add. For example, if a certain article in our catalog is quoted at $1 and your hardware merchant asks you $1.50 for the same article, we wish to say in behalf of your hardware dealer that this difference of 50 cents does not represent an excessive profit he is charging you. For by reason of his being compelled to buy from the wholesale houses in small quantities, he is compelled to pay more for this article than we would pay for we buy in very large quantities direct from the manufacturers. His sales are necessarily small, his expenses necessarily large in proportion to the amount of business he does, and he must get his costs, his expenses, and a fair profit out of the goods he sells. We number thousands of our very best customers among the merchants in all lines in every state. Thousands of merchants in all lines are constantly buying from us. We feel there is ample room in this big, rich, growing country for all the country merchants who are engaged in honest merchandising, and there is also room for us. It is not our desire to build up our business, now already very large, by attempting to tear down any retail business already in existence. The country merchant who undertakes to antagonize the catalog house really antagonizes his own customers. He really questions the right of his customer to spend their money where they like. Instead of injuring the catalog house, he is injuring his own business and building up the business of the catalog house. So I love this now. He's saying, you know what? They have to buy in small quantities. Their sales are small. We can do it in bulk. Many retailers actually buy from us, which was true. And any complaint against us is really a complaint against the customer, right? Just fantastic copy that he's trying to get across, again, to the farmers, remember. They are the audience of this letter, and who Sears is trying to convince and remind of the value that the organization brings. So this is really how Richard fought back at the time and how Sears really fought back to all the opposition. But as we've seen in sales numbers and everything we heard so far, I mean, Sears was just doing fantastic. And customers were rewarding the company with sales, with orders. Sears would try to make a stance that it was just one world. They're just trying to give low prices. Then he would compete with rural merchants. So he was just very, very impressive with his copy and how he pushed back at all this objections from the retailers, which just kept coming and coming and coming. But at the end of the day, the customers loved it. The customers loved being able to order things from Sears, and Sears controlled the channels, right? They were able to sell directly to the farmers, through the railroads, and the mail order catalogs. So Sears was able to deflect some of these objections. Now, in 1907, there's another panic, again, another recession. Now, Sears wanted more advertising to deal with the panic this time around. Sears at this time was actually away on Europe. His wife was having some health issues, and Rosenwald was in charge of the operations. And in this situation, Sears wanted more advertising to get out of the hole. Rosenwald wanted to be more conservative, cut costs. This case, with Sears being away in Europe, Rosenwald won this battle, so to speak. It just kind of starts to show a shift in tide for the company, more into the Rosenwald camp, which wanted to be more disciplined in operations, more disciplined in logistics, and less of the let's just advertise like crazy and then we'll figure out how to deal with the orders, which was, of course, the Sears approach. Now, once again, let me give you some revenue numbers for this period that we are looking at. This is when the Sears net sales really pick up. So if you remember, the last number we looked at was the 1895 net sales number, which is $745,000. And of course, in 1895 dollars. In 1896, Sears went up to $1.7 million in net sales. 1897, it was $2.8 million. 1898, it doubled to 5.3. 1899, it went up to 7.9. 1900, it was $10.6 million. 1901, it was 14.6. 1902, 15 million, almost 16 million. 1903, 23 million, 0.2. 1904, 27 million, 0.6. 1905, 37 million, 0.7. 1907, 50.7 million. And 1908, the last year for this period that we're discussing, was 40 million, 0.8. So you can see that in about 18 years, the first revenue number that we have here for Sears is 1891, which was $137,000. And now by 1908, they are a $40 million company. And just to convert that last year, 1908, of 40 million, that is about $1.3 billion in 2024 dollars. So Sears was $1 billion company. We might call it a unicorn of that time. And of course, they're doing this in a time that's filled with panics, filled with recessions, filled with difficulties. You can imagine the lack of communication channels that we take for granted today. They did not exist in the same way. So this is just amazing and staggering just to see how Sears grew and how quickly it was able to achieve these sales numbers. Something that stood out to me is, that Sears spent a higher percent in advertising than retailers like Macy's, but still had lower costs. Sears had about 20% of costs go to advertising, where Macy's cannot do that. And it really seems like the lack of the physical storefronts really helped Sears at this point in time. They could really devote more and more money to advertising and effectively create demand, while retailers like Macy's could not compete at that level. Montgomery Ward is still in the background here, but they're being eclipsed by Sears, right? Sears is just driving advertising like crazy, and Montgomery Ward is just not able to keep up with the same aggression that Sears had. I think this is where Sears really shine. His ability to write copy, to be aggressive, to get catalogs into the hands of people, allow revenue to just grow and grow and grow. Now, on November 21, 1908, Sears resigns. He did this for multiple reasons. His wife's health was one. His own health was not very good. He actually had some issues with alcohol. His aggressive promotion style was out, right? We saw that in the sort of the panic of 1907, where the team leaned towards Rosenwald. So he decided to resign. Rosenwald became president and chairman of the board and took full control of the company. Now, Sears actually took on the board chairman role before Rosenwald for some time, but he never attended any meetings. And he resigned this in November 26, 1913, about 5 years after he resigned from the company. And that officially ended his relationship with the company. On September 28, 1914, Richard Sears died from failing health. And I love this quote from one of the primary books I read here, where it says that, for Richard Sears was born, he lived, he died in an age of schemes. I think that's a great way to describe Richard Sears. He loved schemes. He loved to advertise. He loved to sell. He was very good at it. There's no denying that. And he drove this company from nothing to what it was by 1908 when he resigned. But by that point, the company needed something else. And that's what Rosenwald brought into the company as it becomes more disciplined, and it takes a little bit of a different approach. Look at the summary of the life of Richard Sears. He started with little more than $50 in 1886, where we sort of picked up the story, with his gold watches. And their fortunes would grow, right? Sears would sell his interest in the business for around $10 million at the time, which is around $340 million today in 1908. And that amount did not really include any of his other holdings that he had personally. At his death in 1914, Sears' fortune was estimated at around $17.5 million, which is around $600 million today. And Rosenwald himself, fortune would reach even greater heights. He actually will go on to dispose of about $63 million, which is around $2.1 billion today. So Sears was just doing really well. It's this company that just grew and grew and grew, really on the back of Richard Sears' ability to sell products through copy. Now, this is the era of Sears in 1908, really, when Sears resigns and then, of course, he dies. But the golden age of mail order was actually about to start in 1912. And that is going to be the next phase of our story. We are now in the later years of the stratagem that we are discussing in this episode. We're really looking at the years from 1908 to 1925. And the first thing we have to note is that after 1908, when we say Sears, we are now talking about the company. In previous periods, it was almost interchangeably to say that Sears was the same thing as saying Richard Sears, the man. The company up to 1908 was really a reflection of him, his desire for schemes to drive orders, even though logistically the company couldn't handle them, the copy, the exaggeration, the over-the-top claims. That was really Sears up to 1908. We saw, of course, Sears himself retires from the company in 1908. He really doesn't have anything to do with the company after that. And of course, he passes away in 1914. Now, this period of 1908 is now marked by a different person, someone we have seen in passing, but will now play a major role. And that is Julius Rosenwald. So Julius Rosenwald now takes full control of Sears. And he's taking control at a particularly fruitful time. You see, we're about to enter the golden age of the mail order industry. Now, two forces led to this golden age. The first was the 1912 Parcel Post Law, and the second was a tremendous rise in farm income after World War I. Let's tackle the first one. Now, before 1912, if you remember, farmers were putting out this mailboxes, which eventually became standardized, where the rule of free delivery, the RFD, could come in and deliver mail. This was mostly limited to letters. The catalog itself might fit in some cases, but it was mostly small letters. When they ordered from Sears, when they were ordering groceries or revolvers or guns, or of course the entire home, that was all being delivered by freight, and the farmer had to pick that up from a station, a railroad station. And that's when we saw the idea that, the freight charge was the same if it was 100 pounds versus 10 pounds. Now we're going to see the introduction of what's effectively home delivery. Now the delivery of parcels, of packages, imagine today when Amazon delivers a package to your house of a book or really any kind of package up to a certain limit, but it's pretty generous limit. The delivery of parcels was controlled and handled by private companies. These were packages up to about 130 pounds. And some of these companies did this directly to farmers' homes, but it was highly inconsistent. It was expensive. It was not reliable. In the cities, parcel delivery already existed. It actually preceded the parcel delivery for farmers by many years. But now we're going to see how this is going to change because of a law. Now, Montgomery Ward, the Sears competitor, only had around 10 ships by mail, and about 90% of their shipments were by freight. 10% of those freight shipments were actually done on an express basis. And Sears also only had a very small amount of business by mail, besides the catalog, of course. Now, catalogs were shipped using this sort of third-class rate of 1.5 cents for each ounces. And this legislation we're going to look at, this 1912 Parcel Post Law, is actually going to create this sort of fourth class for parcels, for packages. This law is really as influential as the rule of free delivery law we saw earlier in the previous section. Now, as you can imagine, from the opposition we saw before, retail houses and many companies were completely opposed to this law. They knew it was going to help catalog houses. They knew it was going to allow them now to ship the packages not to a train station, but directly to the farmer's house. So there's a lot of opposition. Now, eventually the law passed in 1912. And, catalog houses like Sears actually stayed neutral when this law was passed. And I'm sure, there's some evidence, there are some lobbying, but for the most part, they were not aggressively pushing for this law in public. And in fact, some of the executives like Rosenwald were skeptical about the impact it might have on the company, whether actually it would actually change the company, being that at the current time, the packages by mail were already very small, but it will go on to make a significant influence. Now, the other element we saw before was the rise of farm income after World War I. Now, the farm land per acre value in 1850 was around $11. In 1900, it rose to $20. And the farmers themselves really had a fantastic post-World War I period, at least for some time. We're going to see another depression that will affect them. Now, let me give you some numbers here. Now, this is a table of the farm income and prices from 1910 to 1925. Again, the period that we're looking at here. Now, in 1910, the cash receipts from marketing in the millions was around 5.7 million. It went up to 5.5 in 1911. It kind of goes up to about 10.7 by 1917. It then decreases in 1918 to 13, increases a little bit to 14 in 1919, and then 12. And then after 1920, we're going to see farmers really struggle and be hit quite hard from about 1920 to 1925, and we'll see Sears also struggle. But they had a period there, especially from 1916 to about 1919, where they were doing very, very well, right? Now, the land values in grain states also rose very rapidly between 1910 and 1920. So in the latter year, the average money value of a farm was more than $12,000, virtually double what was indicated in the previous census. Improvement was even more marked in the West. The average Iowa farm was worth nearly $40,000. So there's a very swift and staggering climb of farm income around this World War I period, and it will decrease quite rapidly after 1920. So this was the second force that really helped Sears and really the mail order business as a whole in this time. Now, what's also intriguing here is that the forces that will eventually kill the mail order houses were also starting to appear at around this time. Cars were becoming more popular. There was, of course, this continual shift to urban centers. So America was quite rural when we started our story, but it was in decline already. There was less isolation. The telephone will come into existence. So all these forces were in the background. And what we can see about strategy is that even if a strategy is going really well, it's effective, there's likely forces behind it that are threatening whatever the strategy is. And we see this. So even in this golden age, with this new parcel law, with this increase in farm income and farm land value, the things that the Sears will eventually have to adapt to are already present. Now, the catalog circulation from 1908 to 1925 was also quite impressive. In 1908, there were around 2.9 million catalogs being circulated. 1916, there was already about 4.6. So we see this increase. There's almost double in the number of catalogs that have been circulated in just a few years. Again, Sears' continual penetration of the customer market. By this point, of course, Sears is now starting to make some more strategic choices about who gets a catalog, right? Many customers got the catalog based on the order volume. They were logistically optimized to reach the best customers, that is the ones who ordered the most. So by this point, all this more sophistication started to kick in. Remember that this is no longer the Sears just run by whatever Richard wants to do and whatever he thinks might sell. There's a little bit more thoughtfulness now behind Rosenwald, and it's no longer just, get a catalog into every single hand, but how do we get catalogs into the most likely customers to buy? Now, I want to make a note here about the catalog too. Sears, and this really goes back to Richard, and it was continue even after Richard left the company. They built an incredible personal relationship with millions of families. And let me give you some examples here. The late Eugene Talmadge, this is a former governor of Georgia, used to tell rural voters that they only had three friends: God Almighty, Sears Roebuck, and Eugene Talmadge. There was a smash hit musical called Finian's Rainbow, which opened in New York in 1947. And they portrayed the mail order house of Sears and Roebuck as the fountainhead of all sort of material things and so on. And thousands of customers, rural customers, will write to the company to request all kinds of things. There was one example where a customer wrote that asking Sears, the company, to select a wife or a husband for them, that they hold their gold dust in trust, that the company helps them pick a name for the newborn child, and of course the company advice on manners and morals. So this is a company that wasn't just a place where you bought things. For many customers, for many farmers, they had a high level of trust in the company and what the company offered in a catalog that they would even ask them to help them select a wife or husband. You can imagine that item never really became popular in the catalog itself. Now, some of the elements that we see in this period are the introduction of installments. Now, installments is just buying on credit. Installment selling, again, was not invented by Sears. There's examples of it being done since after 1800. It became quite popular after 1914 in particular. Sears experimented with all kinds of different installment plans. They started to offer 30-day trials, where the bank offered credit. So actually they would partner with the bank and help the farmer buy on credit. By 1917, the credit terms were offered on plenty of items. There's actually 7 questions that Sears would use to determine credit risk which are in one way kind of really interesting. They would ask about their land value, how much they think of they're gonna harvest, and all kinds of things to sort of gauge the credit. By 1922, now there's quite strict credit terms. Items are being removed and added all the time. That is, which items qualify for credit. And of course, by 1925, the end of our time period of our stratagem here, there is now a very big focus on what's being called easy payments. Now, other retailers like Macy actually also introduced installments in the 1930s. And there's a few items that were really quite conducive for installments. Think of home radios, refrigerators, electric washers, basically many items that require a considerable investment. So for housewives, and I say housewives because they were the ones making the choices, they may have hesitated to buy such a sort of novel luxury at the time, but the argument of 12 easy payments made it much more easier to make this purchase viable. Now, there were other factors that also led to installments becoming much more popular. Again, the urbanization of the country, there were better financial facilities, there were better banks with better ability to provide credit. There was a general social attitude towards installment buying that became much more acceptable. For many people before, installment buying meant going into debt. And you can imagine for many of the farmers, the last thing they wanted was debt. So all these kind of factors were just things that Sears rode really as general trends to offer the installment salon. Now, Julius Rosenwald really spent most of the 1916 to 1919 in Europe for World War I. He was actually part of a committee helping the U.S. government in the war effort, at least for some time. He made, he kind of shows his character in some of the choices he made during this period when he was away for World War I. Just to know he was not fighting at the war himself, but he was helping behind the scenes. So he refused Sears to sell to the government. On the rare situations where it did happen, it prevented Sears from making any profit on the sales. So he just had a very strong belief that his company should not benefit from the government purchases that might take place. At the time, there were some clothes and other items that Sears could provide through the manufacturing facilities that Sears owned. He discontinued his salary in Sears during this time. The company actually researched many articles for free. You got to remember, right? The Sears had this incredible buying organization that understood how thousands of items were made and manufactured. So a lot of this research became helpful for his government appointment. Eventually, the committee that he was responsible for, the work for it became too large, and the work was absorbed by other government departments. At this time, he would go back. He would go back to Sears. At the end of 1919, 1920. Another sort of fun fact is he actually would take Sears catalogs to soldiers in hospitals during World War I, and he admitted that it was actually a very pleasant surprise for many of the soldiers. That is, many of the soldiers look forward to reading these catalogs again. Right? They were just fantastic sort of reading material for many people. They brought a sense of relief for the soldiers. Now, while Rosenwald was away, there was a third character that became the de facto president during this World War I period. His name was Albert Loeb. We haven't talked about him too much. He joined the company around the same time as Rosenwald and Nussbaum, and he knew Richter himself, and he became the sort of the right hand of Rosenwald and helped run the company for many periods. We won't talk about him too much. His influence is perhaps not as high as Sears, Rosenwald, or even some of the characters that would come after the Sears story. So let's keep going forward in our time period here, right? So we know farmers are going to prosper after World War I. There's this increasing demand for American crops around the world. But then a crash starts to happen in the early 20s for the farmers. Now, by the fall of 1920, Sears has way too much inventory as they try to deal with some of the pent-up demand. World War I reduced the demand for Sears. It wasn't such a big financial struggle for them. But after World War I, there was this huge boost in demand for the products. It's kind of similar to what we saw during the pandemic, right? Where there was demand decrease, and then this pent-up demand really just blew up after. But by the end of 1920, now there's too much inventory for the company. Some of the policies that Rosenwald had implemented before he went away for World War I have become a little lax within the organization. You got to remember, right? The organization now is thousands of employees. And now we start to have staggering losses in 1921 due to what's becoming a full-blown depression for the farmers. There's major price drops in nearly all goods. Retailers actually did better during this time, primarily because they had less stock and they could rapidly change prices. We got to remind ourselves that one of the downsides of the catalog was that farmers would have them for many months. So any price changes might take months, if not years, to really be released to everyone. So retailers, by having less stock and an ability to change prices, were able to adjust a little bit better. Now, at this point in time, there's an action that Rosenwald takes, which is praised by many people in the community. He decides to donate $5 million in shares back to the company, and he puts $4 million in cash into the company. Now, he gave himself options here to be able to buy back the shares at a certain price if the company rebounded. But this action that Rosenwald takes by donating the shares and then putting cash into the company, one, it helps the company stay afloat through a tough financial period, but two, actually gets high marks from the business community. There's articles in the Wall Street Journal talking about how fantastic it has been that Rosenwald has done this, how much he believes in the company. So he gets major credit during this time, helping the company steer through, again, a very difficult period. Not the first one. We've seen this. We saw it with the panic of 1893. We saw it when Sears, in the last few years, when Richard was still in the company. So Sears always had this financial difficulties depending on the economy around them. But Rosenwald really gets the credit for helping steer the company through this very tough 1920, 1921, and early 1922 period. The company itself has rebounded by 1922. Now, some interesting points about the merchants, or really actually the buyers within Sears. You remember, right? Sears has this incredible buying organization, and they were quite independent. They were seen as a federation of independent buyers, often clashing with each other, and in some cases not really fully truthful about the quality of the products that they were sourcing and offering for sale. So this is one of the challenges that Sears had around this time. How do you bring into control what are effectively independent individuals with their own little domains? Sears also started to experiment with a couple things that I think foreshadowed their future. They opened branches. So they had a Dallas and Seattle branch, which in some cases, the branches would actually publish their own catalog and just created even more confusion, because now you had a Seattle catalog and a Dallas catalog, and you had the primary catalog from the company in Chicago. But the branches are actually a glimpse into where Sears will go after 1925, when they open retail stores and they start to transition away from the mail order business into just becoming the retailer that we all know, or at least we're more familiar with. The buyers themselves generally did not innovate. This is not a culture of the company. Buyers were taught and trained to just jump on trends. So we talked about cars before. When cars started to become more popular, they jump on that. They offer cars. The cars themselves, they didn't sell well, so eventually they would discontinue. But this is how the buyers approached it. Other items that did do well were, for example, high-end fashion clothes did not sell well. I think it went against the fundamental principle that Richard had identified and had built the company around, which was low prices and good enough quality, might be the best way of saying it. That is good enough quality in relation to that low price. So anything that did not fit into this, even during this period, now as we were in the sort of 1920s, did not align well. The modern homes that we saw earlier as well also kind of provide glimpse into the future. Sears actually, besides offering entire homes, they also offer mortgages. They had sales offices, which again could be seen as similar to what retail stores will eventually become. So there were all these elements that Sears was playing with, and I just mentioned them because strategy changes, and strategy is not effective forever. So when Sears transitions to retail stores in 1925, it is not a complete brand new action they're taking. They have actually taken small actions along the way to test the model, whether they knew it or not. So it's not completely new. Now, something that's worth noting here is that Sears started to operate laboratories for managing standards on their items. We saw before how perhaps some of the wool was a bit shoddy. Sizes would vary wildly within items, even within items in the same company, within the same clothing items. And of course, the food itself, the groceries, had to comply with certain laws. Now, around this time, the laboratories became a way to standardize how Sears thought about items, or at least how they sold the items. So from 1915 onwards, there was a stronger bias for truth in advertising. The Iowa station technique that we saw before, where Sears would give catalogs to affiliates and then get neighbors to buy, that went away. And some of this was driven by external forces. The FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, was established in 1914. Around the same time, Sears actually established laboratories. And from Sears' perspective, it was highly important to comply with FTC standards because they were very dependent on U.S. mail, which was, of course, another government agency. So some of the items we saw before that were questionable started to go. Patent medicines was one of those to go. Remember, these were the medicines that would claim to cure any kind of disease or issue, but the science itself was really not backed by science. And, these medicines were removed from the catalog despite the high profits. So we're starting to see Sears move towards more respectability, and the laboratories played a huge role here to help them ensure that as small meant small, that wool was wool. So Sears created all these kind of laboratories to test their items. At the same time, the catalog space started to be quote unquote sold to different departments. So buyers will have to prove that they can sell items within the restrictions of the laboratories. So we're seeing a company also adjust how it thinks about the space itself. Now we're coming to the end here of our story. And in 1925, Sears will go into the retail business. And it was not a business that they perhaps knew as well. There were, of course, other competitors like Macy's, which we've seen often. But there were also other competitors like JCPenney, which by this point had over 676 stores and about $91 million in sales. So Sears is taking this mail order technique that they perfected. And they put all this administration behind that, right? They had all this way for handling and opening thousands of letters, for managing returns, for being able to fill orders within 24 to 48 hours. They perfected this entire mail order business. And by this point in time, as we get to 1925, it is time to move on. It is time for a new strategy. Sears, of course, had about twice the net profit as Macy's and Montgomery Ward. And it actually even had less inventory than Montgomery Ward, which was also striking. So they had more inventory than Macy's, of course, the retailers, but they were more efficient in their operations than Montgomery Ward, the closest competitor. And I think this is just credit to Rosenwald, who managed a very efficient and lean operation, at least, within the the mail order business itself. The last thing I'll mention here is, we talked about factories a lot from Sears. If you remember, they would sometimes invest into specific factories to try to produce the volume. They actually had by 1920 about 15 factories they wholly or partially own for pianos, for agricultural implements, for men's clothing, old stoves, school furniture, chairs, pumps, stoves, and so on. So this is just one of the ways in which Sears tried to control their inventory and try to manage it appropriately. Now let's finish this section with the net sales of this period. Now the last number we saw was the 1908 net sales, which is $40 million. That was around $1.3 billion, if I'm correct. So let's look at how Sears grew during this period after Richard steps away. Now in 1908, net sales go up to 51 million. 1910 is 61 million. 1911, 64 million. 1912, 77. Then it goes up to 91. In 1913, 96 million. 1914, 106 in 1915. 137 in 1916. 165 in 1917. 181 in 1918. 233 in 1919. Again, right, this sort of post-World War I boom, huge for Sears. 245 in 1920, that sort of peak of post-World War I, the new parcel law and the rise in farm incomes we saw before. They have a very severe drop to 164 in 1921. Imagine that. They go from $245 million to $164 million in 1921 as Sears suffer crazy losses. This is when Roosevelt is stepping back in, right, when he's doing his donation of shares and injecting cash into the company. 1922, they do $166 million. 1923, they do 198, and 1924, 206, and by 1925, they are back to 243. So $243 million in net sales, which would be about $43 billion in today's money. So again, this is Sears, right? This is the company that Richard started with gold watches sent by accident to him, and which have now has outgrown Richard himself. He's no longer, of course, alive, and has just become this huge mammoth of a company. We are now in the conclusion of our stratagem for Sears and the mail order catalog. And what a story it's been. As with all strategy, eventually things change, right? The conditions that allowed Sears to do this are starting to change quite drastically. So let's look at some of the ways in which Sears will eventually move away and the lessons that we have really when it comes to strategy. By 1930, America now has more urban citizens than farmers. This is a trend all the way from 1880. You gotta remember. So it's not completely new. In fact, if you look at the numbers here, in 1880, the total population in America was around 50 million. The urban was 28%, and the rural was 71%. By the time we get to 1920, again, just a few years before we finish our story, the population in America is 105 million. Urban is 51, and rural is 45. This actually 1920, is the first time where the urban population is larger than the rural one. It's a bit of a key moment in time. So just a few years before we finish our strategy and before Sears would start to move away from mail order business, the urban population crosses over the 50% mark. And by 1930, the American population is 122 million, and 56% is urban, 45% is rural. And this trend, of course, will continue on and on and on, even to today, where we have a significant urban population compared to rural. So this is a major, major shift. Now, some of the other shifts that we saw before that made Sears adopt a new strategy after 1925. One was cars, which you saw before. The first gasoline car was operated in April 19, 1892. And by 1920, there was already 8.2 million cars in operation out there in the United States. So lots of people are having cars. Cars are going to become important because they will allow urban consumers to drive to retailers, to be more willing to drive for a little bit to a retailer, especially if the retailer is larger. So it's no longer about a small town retailer, a small retailer in sort of the downtown of a city. Now you can drive to a big box retailer, just like in the same way some people today might drive to IKEA, right? Because IKEA is huge and it has this big stores outside of the urban centers. Gasoline cars also affected farmers in the same that gasoline power machines really helped farmers, especially in the 1910 to 1920 period. So this gasoline power machines really helped them be more productive. And this productivity in farmers, again, continues on to today, where today's farms are really much smaller, but highly more productive than they were back in 1910, 1920. Now, by 1930, about a third of the farmers had telephones. That is, they had a way to communicate with others besides just letters. Besides just sending a letter to someone, whether that's to Sears or someone else, they now had a telephone, right? And this was actually raised further by the Rural Electrification Administration, the RED, that will come from the New Deal. So the New Deal in the 1930s with Roosevelt, with FDR, then will become another way in which farmers will become much more sophisticated. Now we have to finish this episode with just the impact the catalog had. Even though the catalog today is just something you see at the past, at the time it had a huge influence on farmers. And because farmers were the majority of the population in America, it meant they had a huge influence on America itself. It is actually said that perhaps the catalogs had more influence on the standards of living, more even than films. So let me give you an example. The catalog was actually a huge power in making primitive standards of living obsolescent. So outdoor plumbing today is regarded as being sort of the mark of poverty, the fact that you don't have water and so on. So a few years after the catalog presented indoor plumbing systems, most farmers then started to adopt this same plumbing systems, right? They saw them in the catalog first, and it showed them the possibilities. And then they started to move away from just this outdoor facilities. Pictures or motion pictures, movies have been claimed as having this huge influence on American life as a way to create a standard of dress, to make people conscious of their personal appearance, to form desires for new luxuries. But before motion pictures really had a way to reach farmers, before they became as widespread as they were, especially with more people in urban centers where you could actually go to theaters, catalogs actually did this, right? They provided what became the standards of dress by showing the items that were popular, the suits, the men's clothes, the women's clothes. They provided this incredible buffet of desires of products you can buy. And they created new desires for products that farmers perhaps never even knew they needed because they had never seen it before until they saw it in a catalog. So in this element, catalogs are likely much more influential than motion pictures, especially if we're looking at the period before 1925, before 1930. Here's another, just a fun anecdote. The President Franklin Roosevelt once suggested that the best way to deal with anti-American propaganda from the Soviets would be to fly planes over Russia and drop Sears catalogs. Now, of course, he's saying this in the 30s, but just to show you the influence that the catalog really had on American life. And in late 1940s, when an Associated Press Moscow bureau chief returned home, he reported that, quote, the Sears Roebuck catalog and the phonograph record are the most powerful pieces of foreign propaganda in Russia. It was really another way of saying that the catalog has become authentic Americana. Now, after 1925, things would change for Sears. It would open retail stores and start to compete with Macy's and JCPenney's and so on. Cars, of course, as we said before, highways would become also important, and we can actually see them as competition to the railroads. And this would lead to the era of the big box stores. Now, Sears would continue the mail order catalog until 1993, where it would get officially discontinued. But, of course, as the years went on after 1925, the mail order catalogs had less and less influence in the company. Urban customer will become the new customer. It will no longer be about the farmer that Richard Sears identified and got to know himself when he was a station agent in Minneapolis. Now it's a new customer. And of course, technologies like the telephone would change how consumers buy and discover new products. Now, the strategy that Sears uses after 1925 is a story for another podcast. That's the story of the retail store and not one that we are looking at. So with that being said, this has been the story of Sears, the mail order catalog, and the railroads that changed America from the late 1800s to 1925. If you stay around to this long, I really appreciate you. My name is Ruben Ugarte. This is the first episode of Stratagems. I'm excited for future episodes. I got a bunch of other great strategies that I want to deconstruct, dive deeper, so we can find those insights, so we can understand how strategy actually plays out within organizations. Be sure to follow, share this podcast, send me an email with what you think. I'd love to hear that. And until next time, we'll talk soon.